Test. Speaker mic. We have no signal on speaker mic. Hello, everybody. We're going to get started real soon. Co-op session. Once we get the AV issues figured out. Check 1, check 2, check. Hans, how you doing back there? There should be some blinking lights, maybe. If you're getting any gain at all from the mic, even if it's muted. Check 1, 2, check. Hope everybody's having great meetings so far. We've had some meeting temperature threads on the. Oh yes, here we're coming. Oh, we've got staff, professional staff. Good. I've been finding the meeting temperature actually pretty good. I haven't needed a sweater in most rooms. That's pretty good. Test. Can you now hear me? Test. Oh. Test. Oh, wow. Okay, now we put it over here. Okay, let's get started. Second session. Here's the agenda. We start with resource indicators, MPLS. Dick is going to talk about 2 working group documents. We have a little bit of echo here. Okay. And then we're going to have 2 remote presentations, and hopefully those 2 work out fine. We mailed the guy, or bend it.
Maybe turn it off.
I don't have the remote control. Yeah, obviously. Okay, Brian. Be careful, the mic is very sensitive. So yell at it.
Don't yell at it. Okay. Be very careful.
Oh, hold on. We don't have a meeting minute taker. Who's going to take the meeting minutes?
I'll do it.
Thanks, Mike.
Plus Tony wants to volunteer.
Matt, can you again watch the
You
chapel?
wanna do this with me?
Okay. No, of course. Yeah.
He who writes the minutes gets to control the agenda.
Brian, go.
Okay, Brian Go says on us.
That's right.
And I will go
It's a technique I've used for years.
once everyone quiets down. Okay, second OAuth session. Welcome, everybody. Talk real quickly about OAuth 2 resource indicators. Just for the record, I hate this name, but I came up with it years ago and I can't think of anything better. But if you have any real suggestions, I'm happy to hear them on the list or in person or whatever. But yeah, resource indicators, here we go. So a little bit of context about what this draft is. Basically, there's not a lot to it on the surface anyway. It defines a resource parameter. that basically is just a URI or URIs where the client is requesting access. And this is applicable both at the authorization endpoint to convey basically the requested access of the whole grant that's being asked for. And it's also applicable at the token endpoint, which is more specifically about the scope of use of the access token that's being requested right there. What resource are you going to use that particular access token at? Why are we doing this? There's a lot of reasons, but largely because knowing the target resource where the access token is going to be used enables that token to be minted and constructed appropriate to that resource itself, and that might involve encryption. The various content or claims in the token might vary based on the target, whether you want to do a reference style token or a self-contained JOT token. Various keys or algorithms that are used might vary based on the target resource, and et cetera. It also facilitates proper audience restricting of access tokens. So by knowing where it's going to be used versus just the scope of access, you can put a proper audience restriction in there. The draft right now says that the AS can take the resource URI value and use it exactly as provided, or it might map to an audience value that's a more general URL, or even potentially, depending on the deployment, abstract identifier for that resource or set of resources that it's valued legitimately for. And a question that came up, at least when we've talked about this in the past, is what about scope? And at least conceptually, the idea here is that scope is about the what kind of access is being requested, while resource allows for the actual where to be conveyed independently of the scope. So that's sort of the idea there. And I'll go to the next slide. I'm worried about what Torsten's going to say. So a couple notable happenings since Montreal. This document's been around for quite a while, but it got adopted as a working group document shortly after Montreal. I talked about it there at the meeting. We published the 0.0 draft. And it was just, the 0.0 was just a copy of the individual draft, which honestly hadn't been updated in any substantial way for a number of years. So a few months later, I got around to publishing a version 1 of it, and a few notable changes in there. I changed the error code from invalid resource to invalid target. It means the same thing, but this was to align with the same error code that's already in Token Exchange, which has some conceptually similar functionality in a more limited scope. You can indicate the desired resource in a Token Exchange request to the token endpoint. This is the same concept, but it's more generally applicable to all requests, all grant type requests to the token endpoint, as well as the authorization endpoint. So just aligned the error codes so that they'd be the same there. Also in alignment, they drifted in earlier stages of editing, but I updated this draft again to come in alignment with Token Exchange, and the resource parameter is now allowed to have a query component. I tried to simplify things by taking that out, but to be consistent, and there were use cases expressed that desired that. So it's now allowed here. And I don't know how to summarize it all other than to say I really significantly reworked the whole main section and content of the document to try to explain how it works better, explain how the resource parameter might be used on the authorization endpoint to request total sort of location. I wanted to say scope, but that word's a little overloaded. To all the resources requested for the whole access grant that's being requested there versus how it would be used on the token endpoint to specifically request a narrowly targeted audience restricted token, and just tried to explain that, added examples through it. It's all sort of functionally the same as it was before, other than the 2 changes indicated above, but is hopefully a lot more clear. And this was based on feedback we got in the discussion in Montreal, as well as a lot of list conversation post that. So I tried to clarify those things, make it more straightforward, hopefully a little bit easier to read. And can't really summarize anything more than to say that and request people take a look at it, and hopefully they find it is easier to read and understand. So that basically just leaves us looking ahead to the next meeting. I'll not be able to be in Prague, so you won't have to be subject to my photographs, at least that time. And I just ask at this point that people review the version 1 of the draft, because it has been largely reworked from the original version. Again, like I said, it hasn't changed functionally so much as just tried to explain the use cases and the usage and how it would be applied a little bit better. And that's all on this one.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. Part of the virtue of this draft is there's very little there, and what's there is existing practice. Therefore, I ask the chairs, is it time for working group last call?
So let me ask the group. So are there any objections in starting a working group last call? Who read the document?
The most recent version. Yeah, I was going to ask about that, but thought it might be a little premature. I'm certainly happy to see it move forward, though, if people think it's ready, or at least ready for next steps. It is, after all, just a parameter.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's very little error there, which is a virtue.
Yeah. Well,
One comment from Justin Richard. He's worried about people confusing resource and audience and similar things like scope and practice.
That's terribly actionable. Thank you, Justin. And in practice, those things already are getting confused. I've tried to clarify how they might be used and what you can do with one or the other in the document as best I can, but I think it's a legitimate concern that I don't know it's made any worse by this document. Hopefully it's made a little bit better, or at least given possibility to express things more accurately to what they are.
Thorsten, yes.com. It's not a perfect solution because it disentangles resource and scopes. And my personal opinion on that is we should have a solution that allows us to specify the resources and what can happen on those resources, which would allow, yeah. But nevertheless, I'm fine with that. And I contributed to the rework. So it addresses a lot of use cases I'm worried about. For example, that we need a mechanism to really implement audience restriction. Something that we're also pointing out in the security BCP, but we don't have a mechanism for that right now. And that's why I'm also give my +1 for moving the world forward.
Thank you. To that point, I think there are, were we starting from scratch, there's a lot of things we could do to kind of capture both sentiments more expressively in a single parameter value, but we're not. So the goal of this was to very pragmatically layer on an extension on top of what we have in order to facilitate this kind of stuff. It's not to say it's the best solution, but it's a pragmatic approach.
Thorsten, again, I agree. We also specified how the resource server can melt down the scope in the access token, taking into account the particular resource the access token is being minted for. And so I think that's an okay solution.
Good enough.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah.
so
Sorry, cut you off.
let's do a working group last call in document.
Mike Jones, I'll state also that in support of Torsten, that there's plenty of existing practice already using this.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Thanks. This work. Okay, thanks. The other set of slides?
Yeah.
This is my last one, then I'll get out of here. Hey, look, another picture of Bangkok.
Yeah.
This is about mutual TLS, OAuth2 mutual TLS client authentication and certificate-bound access tokens. Also not a great title, but it's hopefully reflective of what it is. This picture was taken outside my window in one of many long episodes of jet lag and being able to sleep here. Anyway.
Were you writing drafts during your jet lag?
I should have been, because I wasn't getting any other work done, but I was trying to sleep unsuccessfully. So what is this and why are we doing it? Basically, the draft defines an enhanced security for OAuth2, and it's based on TLS client certificates. And a lot of this stuff is already being done and being used by open banking and PSD2 type regulatory regimes that are demanding things like API-based payments, but they want to have a stronger security profile than just pure bearer tokens for that. So there's already a suite of standards out of not IETF, but other types of organizations and consortiums that are building on top of the functionality provided in this standard. So what is it exactly? It's two things largely. It's an asymmetric key-based client authentication mechanism from the OAuth client to the authorization server, relying on mutual TLS. And then there's two subcomponents of that, two ways to do it. One is a PKI-based mode where the subject DN is provided during registration time to the authorization server. The authorization server verifies the client certificate down to a trusted CA when it's presented in the TLS handshake, and then checks to see that the subject DN in that certificate matches the expected subject DN from the configuration for the client. There's also a self-signed certificate mode, which is basically just pre-registration of static keys. And then rather than validating the trust chain, you just do proof of possession at the TLS layer to ensure that the private key is held associated with the certificate, and then you just match up the certificates verbatim to what's in client configuration. Then on top of that, or on side of that, in addition to that, I guess, there's a mutual TLS certificate-bound access tokens for proof of possession on protected resource access. So it's a way to bind these access tokens that are issued to the client certificate and then have the client prove possession of that certificate and corresponding private key when it's doing protected resource access, which prevents replay, crossplay. It prevents a stolen token from being used, and it prevents a resource server that receives that token from turning around and using it somewhere else because they can't demonstrate proof of the corresponding private key. And along with this, in order to represent this information, we've introduced the X5T certificate thumbprint confirmation method, which is just a sub-member for the CNF claim, and it just carries the SHA-256 hash of the certificate itself. Some things that have happened with this document since Montreal. We went through a working group last call. We had the Shepherd write-up done shortly after that. Updated in draft 10 to use the RFC version of AS metadata and the associated registry. In draft 11, updated and added a reference to TLS103. Got some developer feedback off list that basically asked for some clarifications around some things, particularly around exactly how the confirmation hash of the certificate was generated and the encoding of that. So tried to clarify some wording that may be clarified again based on some AD feedback, but that also resulted in adding an example certificate and corresponding value so that developers could actually check their work and make sure it matches up to what's specified. After that, we got some more feedback off list, but it was feedback that came into the list this morning. I'll talk about a little bit more in some detail section here. And then yesterday morning, the AD review rolled in, so we'll be looking at that as well. So the first question that came up from that most recent developer feedback is around support for subject alternative names. I say here basically that all the cool kids are using sans nowadays, and contrary to what I was thinking, they're even doing it for non-HTTPS server certificates. Thank you. Get off my lawn. And it's been suggested that the usefulness and useful life of this draft could be greatly expanded if we supported subject alternative names in the PKI client auth mode. So as I said before, right now, all that's supported is specifying an expected subject DN, and folks are asking for equivalent type functionality to allow for specifying an expected subject alternative name. The one specific request was specifically for a URI SAN, but I think, thinking about this, we want to at least consider more general usage, other type of SAN names, that's duplicate name, but yeah. So what's the working group to do? Tell them to get off my lawn, leave it as is, push it forward. It's really appealing because we're so close to being done with this, but I think there's really merit in the request, particularly for the way the winds are kind of blowing now and certificate usage. There seems to be a real impetus towards using subject alternative names rather than the subject DN itself. So I'd like to see the use of this, the usefulness of this expanded and try to accommodate these use cases. Shall I?
Mike Johns, Microsoft. I appreciate the request. I'm concerned that the more mechanisms are specified, the less interoperability implementations will actually have. And I know Ecker's been involved in discussions on that. I'd be curious to hear thoughts.
Well, I was one of the kids who was on the lawn.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so, I mean, I guess it seems to me like maybe start by making a hopefully uncontroversial assertion, which is that if nothing were deployed, it would be better to use SAN. And if people disagree with that, then probably we should fight about that. And if people agree with that, then we're talking about what's better to have in the case where we have a bunch of stuff deployed that uses DN. So I guess I'm going to pause for a second and see if anybody thinks we'd be better off using DN than SAN in a greenfield situation.
The problem, John Bradley, Ubico, the problem is that there is no greenfield situation. Unfortunately, we have a large X509 legacy, and even subject alt name is an oversimplification because there are 9 of them. So yes, you can match the subject alt name, but they are syntactically different between IP address, DNS, email, of which the format is creative. So the basic protocol works independent of this. Really, we're talking about how in dynamic client registration would you register what was to be matched. And
Yes.
Once we start opening it up, it becomes quite large. And I guess the concern is, how do we actually get interoperability? I mean, immediately we have European EIDAS certificates that have unique extension points. So in some cases, to actually be useful for banks in Europe, they may actually have to look at a specific EIDAS extension to determine what kind of financial institution they are. Such. So in the generic case, how much do we put in for interoperability versus maybe just saying, okay, you're going to have to sort it out amongst yourselves. Whoever is registering is going to have to understand, and whatever the AS is going to have to negotiate what the fields are that's going to be matched. I don't know.
As it stands now, it's around dynamic client registration, but even though a lot of sites, a lot of ASs don't support dynamic client registration, it very much implies a data model for clients and what will be available in terms of configuration, whether it's dynamic or not.
TorstenNoderstadt.ts.com. I agree. It's more about the client model and the way the identifier is matched during the authentication process. But nevertheless, I've got one question, John. Are you suggesting that we stick with DN and just add a statement? If you want to use other attributes of the certificate to match, please do so and specify somewhere.
That is one way of approaching it. I don't know that, the problem is I don't know that we can do a satisfying job of trying to cover everything that people are going to want to do. So adding one, so if we add one subject alt name match for URI, that's going to satisfy a small subset of people who are then going to be angry or believe that their use case can't be satisfied because they have no way of getting a certificate with a URI subject alt name. Because, well, EIDAS or whoever just doesn't produce it.
Torsten, again, I understand that. I mean,
I would like to do something though that's pragmatic and functional and not, I understand the potential complications, but I don't want to, nor do I think we can account for all possible cases.
from my perspective, may I? Okay. I mean, the obvious solution is to define a registration parameter per subject alternative name.
Type.
Yeah, you already proposed four of them, I think, in your email in the morning.
It wasn't me. That was
The other guy?
that was the gentleman that.
Okay.
So somebody contacted me off list originally about this, and I urged him to send something to the list before this meeting. And
Okay, which would mean
he got that a few hours ahead of time.
So
And
the
he
book-
mentioned 4 that he thought were particularly common. I responded with maybe different ways those could be represented, which is a individual field per, or potentially like a structured field that carries the value and the type underneath it. I am personally still really like the idea of just a field that carries the string and being able to say, oh, whatever, just match them all. I realize there's a potential for sort of name conflicts across types and maybe some crazy sort of way to get a certificate issued where you could impersonate someone else based on that, but it feels awfully unlikely. I know I'm in the minority on that statement, but anyway.
I don't know whether
I'm
you're a
rambling.
minority, but I would strongly not recommend to go that way
I'm
because
aware.
it feels very bad to just scan across all the attributes and try to match the name. So from my perspective, either we go and define a registration parameter per subject to alternative name and potentially the organizational identifier for EIDs as well. Or we just specify you can use other attributes to match, but do it in a reliable way.
That's fair.
But I think we should try to really support the use case. I don't mind about subject alternative name, but the use case that the gentleman brought up is use of MTLS in the context of a microservice architectures. We use MTLS in this kind of architecture as well. And what typically happens, TLS is directly used to authenticate and authorize access among services. And MTLS gives the ability to just do the MTLS once and then use access tokens to authorize microservice access.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important that we have support for that, whatever we decide. But I think the use case is important.
So, I mean, when I first made this observation, as I understand it, like basically what the client does is the client says, in future, you'll be able to, like, if I present a certificate that matches this, you ought to be happy with me, right?
From trusted.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my concern is like that managing DNs has proved to be extremely difficult. The semantic information in a DN is like largely meaningless for most environments. And so like, that's the reason why we've like started moving towards SAN, towards SAN structures. I mean, that and the ability to have multiple identities, obviously. So, I mean, it seems to me that, like, I don't think you have to like define every single possible kind of SAN. I think you could pick one and be like, whether it's RFC22 name or, or whatever. I mean, like, it's just like, I guess my point is like that like historically, like DN has been very hard to work with. And so unless you're going to be like, and the fact that you're like, oh, let's like go to the textual version of this is like also very hard to work with. So it's just like, it's pushing against the direction everybody else is going.
So I think that's fair and legitimate. I don't think that removing support for specifying the subject DN is really on the table right now, or at least I don't want it to be, because there are large scale deployments. That may be too much to say. There are definitely real production deployments that are relying on the DN functionality currently. Whether that's in line with the direction of things or not, that's what's happening. So at this point, it's about if and how to also allow for a SAN to be the subject identifier for the client. And then I suppose how to represent that and which particular SANs or all of them to allow for. So I suppose the first question is really if we feel that this is worth pursuing a solution for in some manner in the draft. I think the answer is yes, but maybe that's a question we need to hum on. And then if the answer is yes, talking about exactly what that solution looks like. Because there's obviously, I've seen already, there's obviously quite a few different opinions on how that should work and what should be allowed for. And I'm in the lovely position of trying to actually write one of those down that'll satisfy at least some majority of these people. These people being you people.
Yes, I would like to cut the discussion at some point in time.
Sure.
Like so far, I didn't hear anyone saying that SANs should not be supported. I just hear people arguing about like how. Do I hear that correctly?
Mike Jones, Microsoft. I'll actually ask the use case question. I understand that for open banking and perhaps Berlin Group implementations, what you've already specified is used in practice, so we should obviously keep that. I understand Ecker's and others' point about SANS being at least, the current future in the past X509 PKIX world. But I'm curious whether anybody actually has a use case where they're going to use mutual TLS
Whatever's the use case mentioned.
authentication
Yes, so
Mike.
for OAuth
yes, so the use,
with a SAN.
yes, there was a use case mentioned. It was from the guy that emailed this morning. He's part of the group. They call it a standard, but it's a GitHub project that is the secure production identity framework for everyone, or something like that. SPIFFY, I think, is the acronym. Basically, they have this concept of a SPIFFY document that identifies a service. There's one binding for that, which is an X509 certificate right now, and they represent their identity as a SPIFFY schemed URL with a trust domain, basically, and a path that follows it that indicates the service. That's about all I understand about it. But their X509 document format that underlies their whole production framework, whatever it is they're doing to facilitate trust, using OAuth in many cases between services in a data center deployment, is relying on mutual TLS with client certificates that only have a SAN value to identify the party.
Okay, fair enough. So
So I guess what we need to do is to investigate these use cases a little bit in more detail, and then.
I don't.
Or you
I
don't think
really
so?
don't think the use cases are in question, other than telling people that this can only ever happen with subject EN, or do we want to allow for SANs?
So what are you proposing to do?
Fix it? Adjust the draft to allow for some kind of representation of SAN for a client.
Okay.
But that was the first question, I guess, was wanting to gauge the acceptance of that within the working group. Again, my sense is it's a yes, but we sort of jumped past that to trying to solution it.
So John Bradley, Yubico again. So one of the things that is sort of inevitable is that the authorization server is the one that's going to decide what the acceptable matching is. So maybe one way around this is to have the authorization server say what subject alt it actually intends to match, and then have a generic field for the client to say, this is what I want you to match, but let the server decide.
So no discussions on the mic on this topic anymore. We take this to the list and hash it out there. We can also use time during this week to maybe put some clarity around it, the different options, pros and cons, because we are running out of time. This exceeds already the time budget.
I'm well aware. Thank you.
And
All right.
and you
Did I do that? Okay. A couple other open issues really quickly.
really quickly.
What can I do? The draft currently describes how you can do certificate-bound access tokens with public clients. There's a use case for that. I think it's really valuable. It's been suggested by some that it'd also be useful to describe how to do certificate binding for refresh tokens for those public clients. This is the first time it's come up, but the question really is, should we do this?
And the other question is, like, how does that differ to the Bob distribution, key distribution? Is there some intersection here, which I don't understand?
I don't think there's anything, and
Maybe.
I don't know. I guess it is a question. So it's a question, I guess. And then somebody else got all fired up on the list about the fact that client certificates are sent in the clear in versions prior to TLS 1.3. And it's suggested that some privacy or security considerations be added to the draft around that. I honestly question whether that's really useful in this context. I mean, we're talking about certificates that represent software entities, and oftentimes software entities that have thousands or millions of users and don't actually have, the certificates don't have any user identifying information in them. I could go try to say all that, but I feel like the end result of that section would be, this isn't really a problem. And maybe that's valuable, I don't know, but the question is really, do we need this or not? I feel like the list kind of got ahead of itself. And
This ground seems like it's already probably been covered in TLS 1.2, which is how many years old?
Yeah. I mean, I kind of didn't say this in my review, but I think you should have some text about this. I'm sorry.
All right.
I think you only need a sentence or two, but I think that you should add something.
Okay, good enough. I'll try to muster something up. And then looking ahead, there's going to need to be a new draft because of the review. There's a bunch of editorial stuff that Ecker's asked for. And then we need to figure out what to do with some of these open issues. I guess at this point, take them to the list to try to sort out if and what to do, although I think the if is mostly addressed at this point. And then, yeah, did I mention I won't be in Prague? So I won't be there, but there's always the list.
The- "15 slides, you said it short.
What's that?
15 slides, you said it short.
Just go fast. Hi. There's a clicker. Hi, Dick. Hi, Mike. I don't have any pretty pictures or comics, unlike Brian, who's used up a bunch of my time. Little refresher. I'm going to go through that really fast. So the idea of distributed OAuth is as things scale out, we end up with all much larger systems where there's a bunch of different relationships. So in OAuth 2, it's sort of presumed that there was like one AS and managing a protected resource, and that the client knew the AS for a protected resource beforehand. And global systems, it becomes more dynamic, and you're wanting to learn the AS for a resource, which allows you to change it. So as an example, you could have a bunch of different resources, and the AS could be in different places for essentially similar resources. One of the issues in that then is that it's easier, you got to make sure that the access token doesn't get reused. So the solution is to audience restrict the access token. Oops, is that forward? Did I go forward? Is that forward? Okay. So discovery, you hit the resource, it says you're unauthorized, returns back. So currently we've got link rel information that says essentially where is the authorization server. And then in the draft, I'm calling it the resource URI, but that's kind of weird because universe resource indicator. So it's a resource universal indicator. So I just called it resource identifier. Open to naming that. And then the client confirms that the resource parameter it got back matches the essentially path and host that it got. And then when it goes to access to ask for an access token, it includes the resource identifier per the resource indicator working group document that Brian talked about earlier. And then the authorization server puts that resource value into the access token. So if it's a JWT, the AUD includes a resource identifier. Since the last draft, really the only update I made was to reference the IETF draft resource indicators as a spec for how to represent the resource. Open issues. Kind of moving quickly since I don't have a lot of time. There's been some discussion about should we use link headers or www authenticate header. My original draft had www authenticate. Nat was a big fan of link headers. Some people pointed out that a number of existing libraries just look at the www authenticate header and move that up through how the library works. Brian and I chatted about this yesterday and sort of looked at what are the issues in that. In 6750, the specification says that extra attributes are allowed. So the spec has said that you could have other things in there. Looking for some opinions from the working group, whether to use link headers or add other parameters in www authenticate.
Did you send it to the document for review to some of the HTTP sort of minded groups? Like
No.
they may have an opinion about this. I don't know, do people have an opinion about this here, about this specific issue?
The 6750 already defines the www authenticate usage. We might as well just use that.
So you'd be in favor of www authenticate? Anyone
Doesn't sound like an overwhelmingly strong.
opinion either way?
This is Dave Robin for speaking for BACnet. I would also approve. I would also prefer you just overload W authenticate if you need to add an extra parameter or whatever, but don't confuse it with some links. So we're just now getting used to looking at that W authenticate. Don't tell us to look somewhere else. So
Okay.
Is there anybody that prefers link headers?
Yes, but they're not here.
Well, besides
Nat.
Nat.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll drive that question on the list. I wanted to get discussion here.
Yeah.
Was that should I go back?
Ben Kadek, just pointing out that we do have a closed HTTP auth working group that would have done work with www authenticate.
So we can post it. There are obviously HTTP groups that we could post that question to as well. So when you post that to the OAuth mailing list, it may be good to push that or forward that mail also to one of those lists.
Which list?
Well, the one that.
Could
Ben
someone just
said.
email me and tell me which list? Oh, yeah, or put it in the minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you. AS Discovery, currently we're providing the full URL so that it would be easier for the client to know, just go fetch that. There's some security challenge in there because of course, who knows whether it's really the right URL. Proposing to change that to the issuer value and do the discovery per 8414, since 8414 says how to take an issuer value and get the metadata document. Yes.
Thorsten, I'm confused. How do you construct the full URL from a issue value for OAuth? I'm fully aware of the algorithm for OpenID Connect OPs, but not for OAuth authorization service.
In 8414, it describes how to do it.
No, it describes what you can do, but there is no single algorithm to determine the URL. I could use any application-specific name for the discovery document.
It defines a well-known URI, which is well-known OAuth authorization server. And that's where you put it, and that's the default issuer for an OAuth.
So you're saying that
Yes.
8414 is
That's
not
the
normative?
That's a default, but it's not the only option. There are also examples in there of other URLs pointing to OAuth server configurations.
So
That's correct, and
Okay.
any particular profile will define what it is. And if the profile doesn't define it, you have the default one.
Right.
Justin suggested this, and the working group was all in favor of it, rather than reusing OpenID configuration.
So did you hear any preference for the full URL versus the other approach on the list?
Thorsten stating the obvious, full URL, please.
not so obvious, but okay. Because you're thinking that the discovery isn't the quick. Okay, why don't you read that again? Because we could also provide more, we could profile 8414 to be more specific on how to construct it. Yes, Thorsten?
Of course you can.
Yeah, okay, yeah. No, wrong button, okay. And there was some discussion as people were somewhat confused between sort of the whole URL that you're fetching, making a call versus a URI. I sort of changed the name to be more resource identifier. And that's what's in the IETF draft resource indicators. And the resource URL is the URL the client's calling. So I'll add more descriptions in the doc to clarify between the two of those.
One comment from Justin Richard. We could easily have two parameters, one for full URL document and one for the issuer mutually exclusive.
What? If Justin, you could email what your suggestion is on the list, we could talk about, because that's confusing to me. Because that's actually not what I'm talking about, but.
Torsten, I think we should decide for one way to go.
What's that?
I would suggest we decide one way to go and not use two different mechanisms, because that will confuse clients. The metadata spec says different applications utilizing OAuth authorization service and application-specific way may define and register different well-known URI suffixes used to publish authorization server metadata as used by those applications. What does it mean?
I don't know. You spoke too fast for me to. Which thing are you talking about? Yes.
I think we have to discuss that issue on the mailing list. There seems to be
Which
some
issue is this?
This is this issue.
This issue? This? Okay.
Yeah.
That one. Okay.
Yeah, and this just requires clarification.
Okay. So I get confused when I'm on this slide and people are talking about the
Well,
previous
people
slide.
are still-
Because I have a little brain, so.
Welcome to the OWASP group.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to update, well, I'll take the open questions to the list, and then I'm going to update the draft on some things that we've got some clarity on, and I'll post questions on the outstanding thing, which is really, is it a full URL or an issuer, right? Okay.
That's
Okay. Next up. This one's small. Okay. Hopefully. So a little refresher. OAuth is usually set up that one party is a client and the other party is a resource. We're hitting a bunch of scenarios where both parties are clients and both parties are resources. We need to get tokens back and forth. The user experience flow is horrendous. When you try to do that, you go through one flow and then you got to figure out how do you get back the guy back over to the other place to start a flow. So making setup super complicated. And so the solution is that we complete the second flow back channel because you already have the context, because you have an access token. So you make a back channel call with the access token and the authorization code to kick the other side off to exchange that authorization code for their access token and refresh token. And another advantage of this is that it enables the authorization flow to be started by either party, since it is a symmetric relationship. We've deployed this in Alexa in quite a few places now. The update was changing where you could include the reciprocal scope. We don't use this in our deployments now because it's a pre-configured thing. But if you wanted to go and send that signal, previously it had been in overloading on a flow, and at the Montreal meeting, suggestion of putting it into the request for in the response to the access token request, so that then the client, this is the client, I always get confused, who's who, which, would know what the scope was and then be able to ask for consent then and then be able to push a response.
Mike Jones.
Yes.
Clarifying question.
Yes.
You talk about this being a scope parameter, but the scope parameter is not present in your example. So in what way is this a scope?
It's the scope's called reciprocal.
Why is it not then, quote, scope, quote, colon, reciprocal?
Scope like underscore reciprocal, or like?
There's a scope parameter in OAuth, you're not using it, but you're saying that you're using a scope. I'm confused.
No, he's not using this one in his deployment.
My implementation doesn't, our implementation doesn't have the reciprocal scope. We call this reciprocal to separate it from the scope from the initial flow. Are you suggesting that this one should be called scope?
Or reciprocal scope?
No, I'm just asking for clearer elucidation of what you're actually doing.
Does it help what the clarifying response? Did that help you?
The reciprocal parameter here is used in what context?
It's the scope that the party A would like from party B, I think. I don't know, I always get which one's who's who confused. Annabelle's going to help me out. Maybe.
Let me see if I can further muddy the waters. Annabelle Backman, AWS. So keep in mind, this is the access token response. So this is coming back from the token endpoint. Scope as a parameter name already has a clear definition here in 6749. It's the scopes that are being granted in the access token being returned. So we need a way to represent in this same response body, what is the scope that the service sending this response back to us would like in return. So if this is, I think in your example, Alexa and Sonos, is that right? If this is Sonos sending a response back to Alexa, Sonos needs a way to express what scope it wants a token for from Alexa. And here we're using the reciprocal parameter to represent that. So I think when Dick says it's a scope parameter, he means that it expresses a scope value just like what you would normally put in the scope parameter in an OAuth 2 authorization request. But it is different from the scope property that you'll see in a normal access token response.
Does that clarify, Mike?
Perhaps I'll read the draft.
Okay.
Ben Kaduk, so I'm hearing that this is the scope that you should request in some other flow, not the scope that is being granted in the current flow.
Correct. This is the reciprocal scope you would like, hence the name reciprocal, as opposed to the scope that you just granted.
It's the scope that if Sonos were to make an authorization request, it is the scope that it would request in that request.
Right. Okay.
Crystal clear.
So that's the only change we made to that I've made. Next steps?
Do you think the document is ready for working group last call already?
Who's read that? Oh, there's like 4, okay. Prior version.
Okay, so could I have maybe 3 reviewers? Mike, you said that you're going to read the document anyway.
John said something useful, which is that I'm sorry, John. It's the requested scope in the response. That's very clear. I don't know if John's right.
Read the document, and you would be, Mike, is it okay if you are one of the reviewers? Just to make sure that before we start the working group last call, there actually sufficient number of people have read the document and feel comfortable with it. Mike, you good? So, 2 other folks, just to, Thorsten, Matt.
Thank you.
Mike, can you take that in the notes?
Me, Thorsten,
Matt, 3. That's good.
Done.
Awesome, thanks. So, let's try now, Omar. So the remote presentation. Omar, I think you somehow have to push a button to join. I don't know how that works. Can you give it a try?
Hi, can you hear me? I think you should hear me now.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I just need to figure out how do I share my screen.
Did you send me your slides?
Yeah, I sent it to you like 1 hour ago.
Oh, okay.
But maybe I will figure out how I can share my screen. So
That's okay.
maybe
Just start and keep in mind that you don't have that much time. And I will look up this.
Yeah, okay, I will go over it really quickly.
Just go ahead.
Okay. So hi, good morning. Today I want to talk about a draft I started to work on, a new OAUTH-2018 draft called Seamless Flow. And before I start talking about the draft, I want to talk about why do we need a new draft. Some of you might remember it. I presented it in IETF 101, but I'm presenting it again to answer some questions from the previous one. Can you move slide to the next slide?
I'm still searching for your slides. Just
okay.
Keep talking.
The reason I'm presenting a new slide is that because when we started to work on our application, we tried to find a solution for authentication without any user interaction. All the existing flows for authentications require user interactions from the audience, and this is something we didn't want to do because this affects the user experience. And after looking about all the different ways to implement authentication with OAuth or OpenID Connect, all of the existing flows requires either interactive login or credential space, which is not always an option. So this is why we needed a new flow. The new flow is based, is a bit similar to JWT client assertion, but it has some differentiates to make it easier to use on mobile or IoT devices, and it has some protections in case the user device is compromised. Can you move to the fourth slide?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So yeah, let's go quickly over them. Just click as I'm talking. So the client generates private and public key, send the public key to the server, and then the client can just do the click so it will go. And then the client can also generate two numbers. I'm calling them previous and next. The report should be crypto random, and it sends these two numbers also to the server. Now to request an authentication, the client can sign these two numbers, send the signed payload to the server, and the server can validate it. It do two levels of validation. First, it's validate the signature, and then it validates the numbers. You can see it from the picture that the previous should be equal to next, otherwise it's not authorized. Can you move to the next slide? So this is a really high-level overview of the protocol, how it works, and why we need it. I discussed more in depth all the details, why we need it, difference from existing flow in the draft. So there is already actually two versions of the draft published, and now I'm looking for feedback and comments. This is why I'm also presenting it here today. So I think it's time for questions. I know it was very quick, but I hope it still was understandable.
So do you have some deployments or implementations that?
Yeah. Our production authentication solution that serve millions of users is based on this protocol. Exact same protocol with a bit difference in the namings. I changed a bit namings to make it more understandable, but it's the same protocol working in production for 2 years already. And we are very highly satisfied with it. It solved us a real problem that we faced, and now we have a strong authentication solution between our mobile devices to our backend.
So let me ask the group: who of you has read the document here? Omar posted it to the list. Have you guys had a chance to look at it? Omar, unfortunately, that's so far nobody has read it. So I think a step for you is to see whether you can get some reviewers, and of course we will try to help with that as well. But encourage people to sort of go through it and see whether they have the same or they have the same problems and that need a solution. I think that would be a good next step.
Yeah,
Okay.
actually, I wanted to present here to ask if someone wanted to take a look or it seems relevant to what they're working on, and I highly appreciated the review or feedback. So this is the main reason I'm presenting.
Yeah, you should bring a few people. Typically, from my experience, it's always so Dick Hart will do a review. What typically helps in my experience is if you review other people's document, they will then return a favor and spend the time and review your solution.
Okay.
So we at least have one reviewer. That's good. Okay. And another one.
Thank you.
Thorsten, Mike, did you capture that? So we have two reviewers. Excellent.
Who are the 2 reviewers?
Yeah.
They're not.
No. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Aaron, we have pretty much no time. Is that true? But give us a short summary of what you have been working on. Okay. We should be able to hear you now. I will look it up. Aaron? Aaron, we can't hear you. I don't think it's actually working. That's a pity. Aaron, we can't hear you. And we are out of time.
We're 5 minutes over.
Yeah. Aaron, maybe your mic is not working. Oh, he dropped off. Okay. Well, I guess we will have to just look at the document that he posted. So it's probably, we can ask if, is anyone interested to review his document about JavaScript-based apps, PCP document? Anyone? Okay, we have Matt, we have John, we have Thorsten. That's good. Mike, did you capture that?
Yes, I did.
Okay. I think we leave it at that. We are a few minutes over. I think, oh, blue sheet. Did you guys sign the blue sheet? Okay, it's over there. Anyone? Okay, good. Thank you guys for showing up. Of course.
I have slides.